I think this might be the most internationally adaptable sitcom format ever, definitely since The Office. But I think there's something even more interesting about how you can adapt this particular show to other countries and their histories. Hi, I'm Juliet. I'm a writer and historian, and today I am talking about all the different versions so far of the sitcom Ghosts. I love Ghosts. It is one of my favourite sitcoms. I'm a big fan of both the UK and the US versions. Did you know there is also a German version in production and an Australian version has been announced? Now, since I'm an historian, one of the things I love about Ghosts is the way that the ghosts in each version can reflect the history of wherever it is set. And that means every version is really interestingly different from each other, but they also have quite a few things in common, partly due to the story and basic setup of the sitcom, partly shared histories, and partly just common human traits. So what I thought I'd do today is start by talking through the UK and US versions. The UK is the original. The US version is just going into season 4 this week, and I'm going to compare and contrast those directly. Then I'm going to look at the promo photo that's been released with a bit of information about the characters for the German version and see how that compares to the US and UK ones. And then we really don't know much about the Australian version yet, so I'm pretty much going to end on wild speculation. What I'll probably do is in about 6 months' time I'll release an updated version of this video with lots more details on those other versions. And I'm just going to go through the ghost characters and look at similarities and differences between the different versions and how they reflect the history of wherever they are set and why changes might be made and things like that. I am mainly focusing on the ghosts here. There are also interesting differences between the living characters in the various versions. But being an historian, I'm mostly focusing on the ghosts. The reason that history plays such an important role in all the versions of Ghosts is that the original was written by the team who used to do the children's show Horrible Histories for the BBC. Horrible Histories was originally a series of books. I actually bought the books growing up when I was in primary school, and then it became a sketch comedy show, and the point of Horrible Histories is to educate children about history, but to do it in a really funny way. It had all these kind of regular sketches, like historical wife swap, that was one. There's one about funny deaths. I can't remember what the title was, but like really strange ways to die. And this particular team, who refer to themselves as the Six Idiots, that's not me calling them idiots, they were the main people on Horrible Histories for many, many years. This means a couple of things kind of fed forward into the original UK version of Ghosts. It was written as a vehicle for them. It carries forward their passionate interest in history. They've obviously taken things from Horrible Histories. It's obviously rewritten now for adults. It's a relatively family-friendly show, but it's not aimed at children. But they've taken the types of characters they liked to play, and they've used that as inspiration for their ghosts characters. It also means that the makeup of the group of ghosts was largely determined by simply them. They're the ones writing it, they're the ones playing the parts. And they are 5 white men and 1 white woman. They did then bring on a couple of extra actors to fill in some extra roles as ghosts, as well as obviously casting the living couple. So they do have 2 more women, one of them a woman of colour, who joined the team so that their group of ghosts is not quite so not diverse. But some of their choices about which periods of history they represent and which characters they play are determined by the fact that they are a predetermined group of people choosing roles for themselves and then adding a couple more. This is obviously different for all of the various international spin-offs because they are all starting from scratch. They can create a cast of characters and then just go out and cast them. The basic setup of Ghosts, which is the same in both versions and presumably will be in every version, is that a young woman inherits a large old house from a distant relative, and she and her husband move in. She then has a near-death accident, and when she wakes up from her short coma, she finds she can see ghosts. So the husband is the long-suffering sitcom character who cannot see the ghosts. She does tell him about them and he knows about them from about episode 2 usually, but he can't see them. And usually they are also trying to turn this very large old house that she has inherited into a hotel. The house is called Button House in the British version and Woodstone Manor in the American version. They are obviously different ages because of the different architectural history of those two countries. So Button House is very, very old indeed. It goes back to at least the Tudor period in the 1500s, probably a bit earlier, whereas Woodstone Manor is 19th century. But in both cases they are old houses. The living couple also have different names, largely just to differentiate the different series, I suspect. So we have Alison and Mike in the UK version, and we have Sam and Jay in the US version. Only one ghost is carried over from the UK version to the US version more or less unchanged, very nearly completely unchanged, and this is Pat/Pete. They even have the same ex-wife with the same name, Carol. I say ex-wife, the wife that they were married to when they died. Pat and Pete are, to all intents and purposes, the same character. They are both scout leaders. They don't use the name of the scouts, so they're some kind of children's or boys' adventure club. But you can tell from their uniforms it's meant to be scouts. They have been killed by a child who accidentally shot them through the neck with an arrow, which is actually really traumatic, and the British show kind of almost realised that about 2 seasons in and talked about it a bit. They're very cheerful, they're very kind, they're very upbeat, and yeah, those characters are really almost the same. And that's largely because the Scouts or similar institutions across the US and the UK are very similar. This character is from the 1980s. One of the things that the British writers, the Six Idiots, originally wanted to do was have ghosts from a really broad range of time spans. Obviously, they'd been doing horrible histories, so they had expertise in lots of different areas, and they wanted not just kind of Victorian ghosts floating around. They wanted ghosts coming right up to very recent times and right back to prehistoric times, and they wanted that range. In the case of Pat or Pete, they are from the 80s. All of the other ghosts then have varying degrees of difference. Some are parallel characters who perform similar functions. Some are just completely unique to either the UK or the US version. One of the central ghosts for the concept is Fanny or Hetty. This is the lady of the house. She is a distant relative of the living young woman, Alison or Sam, who have inherited, and she died, in Hetty's case, at the end of the 19th century and in Fanny's at the beginning of the 20th century. They have a lot in common. They're both prim and proper in various ways, although one of their big differences is that Fanny is very much straight-laced, prim and proper. Hetty is a robber baron, so Hetty actually is quite gleefully criminal, which is quite different from Fanny. They are prim and proper in the sense of how they think society should work and young ladies should behave and that kind of thing. So they have very similar characteristics in that way, but they are quite different in that, Fanny is not an out-and-out gleeful criminal. They also both have really quite traumatic deaths. Fanny's death is the subject of the pilot episode, along with the accident that leads Alison to be able to see ghosts in the British version. One of the key structural differences between the US and UK versions is that the British version was shown on the BBC, so no adverts. So a half-hour sitcom is actually half an hour long, whereas the American version has to cut 10 minutes from every episode for adverts. So the American episodes are all slightly shorter. There's only 2 episodes that actually take the script of a British episode and rework it. The pilot and the one about Pete's death, because he's the only unchanged character. But they do have to lose 10 minutes, and the 10 minutes that they took out of the US pilot was the 10 minutes relating to Fanny's death. Hetty, therefore, actually has quite a different death, and that is revealed in season 3 of the American show. So it isn't the same as Fanny's death, but they are both quite serious and dramatic subjects, their deaths. Not that anybody's death is, they're all obviously to some degree serious and dramatic, but some are kind of taken more seriously, I guess, than others, and Hetty's in particular is taken very seriously. Another close parallel is between Julian in the British version and Trevor in the American version. These are both the youngest ghost in the sense that they died the most recently, so not youngest in their age at the time of death. The British one actually has a child ghost in it, but youngest in terms of they have been dead the shortest amount of time. And they both died without wearing any pants, either British definition of pants or American definition of pants. They have nothing on from the waist down. Fortunately, they are wearing a long enough shirt and jacket that these are family shows. They're aimed at a wide audience, but they're not late night, and they are shown on mainstream channels. So you're not going to see anything. They're wearing a nice long shirt. But they do have, again, even more differences than kind of Fanny and Hetty. Their deaths are different, and the reason that they are wearing nothing from the waist down is actually also slightly different. Julian is a very typical 90s Tory MP from Britain who was embroiled in a sex scandal, hence that's how he died. Trevor, however, is a stockbroker from the year 2000, so he's actually the most recent ghost across both shows at the moment. And he's younger than Julian as well. Julian had a wife and a daughter. As a ghost, he then feels very guilty about not having spent more time with them, whereas Trevor was young and unattached. One of the things the American show puts a lot more emphasis on than the British show is romance between ghosts, which happens quite a lot in all sorts of various connotations, partly because they have more episodes to fill. They also have a slightly bigger cast. So there's a lot more focus on ghostly romance in the American version. The British one, not really a lot of romance between ghosts, maybe an occasional hint, but not really very much. But both Julian and Trevor are definitely fond of female companionship, although Julian in a rather more sleazy way than Trevor. And the writers did actually talk about making that change. The American writers talked about how the kind of political sex scandal thing wasn't really the same in America. Obviously, in the 90s, the president was impeached over a sex scandal in America, so it's not quite a funny tabloid newspaper thing. It's more of a desperately serious, this led to impeachment topic. And I think they thought that a stockbroker might be a bit more of a fun character to include. They don't have quite the same history with political sex scandals, whereas in the UK, it's obviously not funny for anyone concerned, especially the poor wife or husband of whoever the people are. Well, we do tend to be perhaps a bit more amused by it. Then we have Robin and Thorfinn. These are both the oldest ghost in their respective houses in the sense of having been dead the longest, not in the sense of necessarily being oldest when they died. But they come from very, very different time periods. So here we're really starting to diverge. Robin is a caveman, Thorfinn is a Viking. So they come from millennia apart from each other. They fulfill a similar role in being not only the oldest but also the kind of gruffest in some ways, although Robin is quite cultured once you get to know him. They're sort of similar in some ways. They have the same ghost power. So one of the things about the ghosts in Ghosts is that some of them will have this kind of ghost power, not all of them, although the American show is adding some as time goes on. Julian/Trevor can manipulate physical objects, which is a very useful power that the plot really needs at least one ghost to be able to do. That is another difference between Julian and Trevor, actually, that I should have said. If I flick back to Julian and Trevor for a minute. In the pilot episode, so apologies for spoilers, but I am only spoiling the pilot, Julian actually tries to murder Alison, outright murder her to get rid of her. She'd just get stuck in the house if she died there, so it's not well thought through. Trevor is trying to practice pushing things, and Sam falls by accident. So that is quite a significant difference. And it does speak to a difference between the two shows as well, that the British show, as is often the case, is just a little bit darker. There's actually some scary moments in the British show. There's a little girl ghost called Jemima who sings in an incredibly creepy way. There's a hitchhiking ghost who's very sad and also slightly creepy. So the British show does have that slightly darker edge to it, and they did eventually address the fact that Julian literally tried to murder Alison towards the end. But Trevor did not try to murder Sam, it was much more of an accident. But they have this power of being able to move physical objects. Fanny can appear in photographs because she is a very typical British grey lady ghost. I don't think it's been revealed whether Hetty does. Anyway, Robin and Thorfinn were both struck by lightning and have the ability to manipulate electricity as their ghost power, which is another one that's quite useful. But Thorfinn is also the subject of my biggest pet peeve with American ghosts, especially as an historian, but also just as a thinking person. Thorfinn, like Robin, speaks broken English. He doesn't speak English grammatically correctly. In the case of Robin, Robin is a caveman whose brain is literally different. He has a smaller language centre in his brain because he is prehistoric and not quite fully developed Homo sapiens. That's why he can't quite speak English properly, even though he's learned it as a ghost. He can, interestingly, speak French properly. It does fall apart a bit towards the later seasons when it's revealed that he learned how to speak French pretty well, but still can't speak English properly. So there are some plot holes even there. But that is the point of Robin's particular language patterns. Thorfinn is a Viking, so obviously he has learned English as a second language after dying as a ghost. But so has Sazapis, who is one of the other American ghosts, who also did not speak English when he was alive, but has learned to speak it perfectly after death. Thorfinn is a fully developed Homo sapiens. There is absolutely no reason over the amount of time he has had that he would not have learned English. Okay, he's had less time than Robin because he is in America, so people around him wouldn't have started speaking English until much more recently than they started speaking English around Robin, but still, he's had plenty of time. He's certainly had as much time as Sazapis has had to learn English. So why has Sazapis learned it perfectly and Thorfinn not? It just doesn't quite make sense. But it is fun to see a Viking, to see that little aspect of American history represented, that Christopher Columbus was not the first person to discover America, which obviously was already inhabited anyway, but that the Vikings also landed in America during the early medieval period. So that's kind of a nice inclusion, and presumably wanting to include a Viking, the team decided that they just didn't quite have room to then include a caveman as well. Getting more and more different now, we have the captain and Isaac, who's also a captain but has a name, unlike the British one who just goes by the captain. These are both military veterans with the rank of captain, and they are both gay, and they are both closeted even to themselves, really, at the start of the show, but that's really where the similarities end with these two. They come from completely different time periods, from completely different wars. So the British captain is from World War II, obviously a very important period of history in both countries, but World War II was actually fought over the skies of Britain, which gives it that more kind of immediacy. In the case of the American show, they've got Isaac being from the American War of Independence. Again, a war they were both in, because obviously that was Britain and America fighting each other, but considerably less significant to British history than it is to American history. The American War of Independence isn't even taught in British schools. We're obviously aware it happened, because at some point the British went over to America, and then at some point they were no longer in charge. That's about the extent of, I think, a lot of British people's knowledge of the War of Independence. It is obviously extremely significant if you are in America, so it makes sense that they have gone for a captain from that war instead. And then the treatment of the character, the British captain never really comes out. You sort of feel like he knows he's gay, he just doesn't talk about it. And it would have been illegal. Homosexual activity between men was illegal during World War II, so it's natural that he would be very repressed about it. Isaac, on the other hand, doesn't realise he's gay, and then he has a coming out story over the course of the show. He also has an entire romantic relationship with another ghost on the property, a British ghost called Nigel. So he gets more attention paid to it. He's also just a lot more camp. The British captain has camp attributes. There are things he likes that are a little bit camp, like musical theatre, but Isaac is openly a huge fan of musical theatre, and his mannerisms are a heck of a lot more camp than the British captain, which I think is just partly to do with different senses of humour across the two countries. These are sitcoms, they are written for different audiences, and what different audiences find funny will vary. Now we have some characters who aren't usually thought of as parallels, but they have some similarities. Mary and Flower. So Mary is a victim of a witch trial in the British version. She has been burned at the stake, and by the way, some witches were burned at the stake, some were hanged. It depended exactly what crime you were accused of. So Mary has been burned as a witch. Obviously you could do that in America. Or possibly she wouldn't be burned, but you could have a Salem witch, but you would have to then set it in Salem. And the show is actually set not far from Salem, it's set in New England, but I'm guessing they didn't want to go the Salem route particularly with it. So they decided to take that character out of the American version altogether. But Mary does have a sort of a parallel in Flower. Flower is a hippie. This is another one where there are hippies in Britain, and there were hippies in Britain in the 60s and 70s, but the movement probably didn't have quite as much cultural impact as it did in the States. It's something that's more important and more of a touchstone to American audiences than to British audiences. So the American show decided they wanted to incorporate a hippie ghost. They also have a lot more 20th century ghosts. The building is newer in the American version, and the ghosts don't have to have lived in the building. They just have to have died on the plot of land the building now occupies, because people like Robin and Thorfinn were just out in the middle of the countryside when they got struck by lightning. But obviously, a lot of them, you've got to have a reason that they came to this spot where they died. So a lot of them, it's because they have been visiting the house for whatever reason, or they lived there. So the American show has quite a few more recent ghosts. That's another pattern we see. But Mary and Flower are both a little bit spacey. They are both not quite 2 feet on the ground at all times, albeit for different reasons. Flower died when she was high, and when living people walk through her, they actually become temporarily high. Mary's is less pleasant. People smell smoke when they walk through her. So they both have a sort of a ghost power, but it's not really much of a power. But they both fulfill that role of that kind of more fanciful female character, but in very different ways and from very different time periods. Oh, and they did both have quite violent deaths because Flower was mauled by a bear. There are also two characters who we know immediately how they died because we can see it on them. The ghosts do all have the marks of whatever killed them on them, but if they died of a heart attack or poison or anything that you can't see on the body, then in some cases it takes ages before we know exactly what killed them. In other cases we know what killed them, but we eventually get an episode looking at how it came about. And finally, on the parallel ghosts, these two really have almost nothing in common. Sir Humphrey in the British version is the second oldest ghost to Robin. He is a Tudor ghost whose head was chopped off, although not in an execution, as it turns out when we eventually see his death. The headless ghost is a trope of British ghost folklore, because that's another of the things that the shows are incorporating, is traditional ghost stories from whatever country they are set in. So Fanny is a grey lady, and Sir Humphrey is headless. Those are very, very common British ghost story tropes. Crash only appears in the pilot and very briefly in the background of a first season Halloween episode in the US version. He is presumably the victim of a car accident because he is dressed like James Dean, at least from the neck down. Again, chopping off people's heads as a method of execution, not a thing in America, which means headless ghosts are also not much of a trope in America. But they don't seem to have quite had any ideas what to do with him. It looks really like they just wanted a parallel, an equivalent to Sir Humphrey, a headless ghost walking around, but didn't actually have any story ideas for him, so he hasn't appeared since. But maybe he'll appear in the upcoming season 4. We have two ghosts who are UK only and who have no direct parallel in the US version at all. First is Kitty, played by Lottie Adefope. Kitty is inspired by a real British gentlewoman called Dido Elizabeth Belle, who was raised by her paternal uncle. Her mother had been enslaved. She is the inspiration for Kitty. So obviously the team have been very aware that they, as a group, were not especially diverse. So they have included a ghost character of colour, and by doing Kitty, who's inspired by Dido Elizabeth Belle, it allows them to bring to light a character not really known unless you happen to have seen the film about her. And Kitty is also just a really fun character as well. She is like a child almost, and a kind of very friendly, bubbly British gentlewoman of the 18th century. But Kitty doesn't have a parallel in the US version. They have a black woman character, but since the only thing Kitty and Alberta have in common is their race and their gender, I think it would be pushing it to call that a parallel. Interestingly, the other British character with no parallel in the American version is Thomas, who is from a time period only shortly after Kitty. Both of them sort of hovering around Jane Austen era. Kitty's a little bit earlier. Thomas is a romantic poet who was killed in a duel, and he is kind of a little bit Byron, a little bit Shelley. He's very lovelorn. He falls in love with Alison, the living woman, and he writes poetry to her. It's played by Matthew Bainton. He's a really fun character. But the American show, I think, was looking for more recent ghosts. And also they've got Isaac, who is from about the same time as Kitty, roughly. Isaac is American War of Independence. He would be probably around the same time as Kitty, or maybe between Kitty and Thomas. So they've already got a ghost from that period and from the key event for American history from that period. So that's presumably why they've decided to cut Kitty and Thomas. So Kitty was replaced with Alberta, but Alberta is a completely different character. She is US only. Alberta is a jazz singer. Her death forms an ongoing plot thread for a couple of seasons in the American version. She's a really fun character, and she has the ghost power of the child character from the British version. So Jemima, the little girl, only appeared in the first season of UK Ghosts, and this is probably because she's a child and the actress has got older and ghosts aren't supposed to age. So she appears creepily singing in the first season, and then we don't see her again. But the power she has, which is that she can be heard by the living when she sings, is then given to Alberta, and it goes very well with her career as a jazz singer. It's also a way of incorporating characters from a diverse range of backgrounds, but without having a character who's going to be so traumatized by something so utterly awful that it's gonna not work for a sitcom. So this is one of the things with a sitcom that every country, everywhere in the world has terrible things in its past and times when people have been treated terribly. They need people who we can watch episodes about their death and still find something to laugh at. The darkest death episode in the American one is Hetty, but they make something quite heartwarming out of it when you watch it. But the very, very dark aspects of history, there's just nothing funny about it. So the American version, they could have gone with a black character from a more recent period, but they're obviously not going to want to go much further back than the 1920s. And I'm not in any way suggesting that there aren't awful problems with racism up to this very day. By any means, of course, there are huge problems with racism in both countries right up to the present day. Alberta also is a celebrity. She is celebrated for her singing. She would, of course, been the victim of racism many times over her life, but she is also a character that people are fans of, and that allows for some slightly lighter storytelling than if you had gone for somebody from the period where so many black people were enslaved. There's just nothing to make jokes about there. The other main American-only character is Sazapis, for the very obvious reason that he is Native American, and I'm sure there are Native American people living in Britain now, but they would have come over quite recently. For most of my life, I thought my ancestors were the indigenous people of Britain. I'm mostly Celtic. I know I sound English. I have one strand of Anglo-Saxon, and then most of my ancestors are Irish or Ulster Scots. It turns out they're not. I only found this out last summer. The waves of immigration and migration and invasions into Britain over the course of kind of prehistory through ancient and into medieval history, there's wave after wave. So you've got Cheddar Man, who's the oldest human remains found in Britain. Then you've got the people who built Stonehenge, the Neolithic people, then the Beaker people come in, then the Celts, then my lot, then the Romans, then the Angles, Saxons and Jutes, then the Vikings, and then the Normans. And then after the Normans it slows down a bit until we reach the modern period, but you've got all of these waves of different peoples coming in. So there really isn't any meaningful way to identify any kind of indigenous population of Britain. It would be the 10% of white British people related to Cheddar Man if you really wanted to be extreme with it, but it's meaningless in Britain. Obviously, in America, that is not the case. The various Native American peoples were living there quite happily until the Europeans turned up much more recently, in the early modern period. So it's very important to have a Native American character. And I think they've been quite wise in choosing the period just before colonisation for Sazapis to come from. Again, it comes down to if you have a Native American character from a period where they're being systematically wiped out, that's not funny. Sazapis comes from kind of just on the edge, like just right before, maybe during colonisation, but it hasn't, like, really, the Europeans haven't really taken root. I think he's from a period where Europeans have arrived, but still early stages. And that allows Sazapis to be a Native American character from Native American culture and not kind of have all this trauma of coming from a period where there was so much suffering being inflicted upon Native American people. Both shows also feature a group of ghosts who died of a disease. Bubonic plague is the implication in the British one, and cholera in the American one, and who live in the basement, and who we hardly ever see, but they exist all the time. In the British version, they're actually played by the same characters as the main cast in different makeup. We really very rarely see them, but the plague pit was a plot point in season 1. In the American version, we see the cholera victims slightly more often, and Nancy in particular has quite a significant recurring role. The American version has so many more episodes, it needs more characters to play off each other and to do things with, and it has more time to play with various characters. They also cast different actors, so they're not doubling up on actors every time they go to the cholera victims, and it also helps keep it a little bit more grounded. It's very much a reminder that you're watching a show when the same actors turn up playing a completely different character. Whereas in the American version, you can stay a bit more immersed in the story because it's different actors. Because the American show has more episodes to fill, there are also a lot more recurring ghosts. It has a lot more one-off ghosts. Both shows have one-off ghosts turn up for various reasons, but a lot more of them in the American show. And it also has some recurring ghosts who aren't in every episode and who live in various corners of the property. So we've got Nigel, Isaac's boyfriend, for a couple of seasons, and his men, Baxter and Jenkins, who are British soldiers. So basically, Isaac's lot were camped just opposite Nigel's lot, and they both died in the camps. Isaac died of dysentery. His ghost power is that you can smell human nastiness when you walk through him. Then you have Stephanie, who sleeps in the attic all year because she's a teenager. She only wakes up for like a few days a year. And she is the victim of an urban legend. She was killed on prom night. So that's feeding into American urban legends and ghost folklore in the same way that Sir Humphrey and Fanny feed into British ghost folklore. For the German version, we've got a promo photo of the key cast, and they have released some character details. So it's really interesting to see where the German version has taken elements from the British one, and it's taken elements from the American one, and where there are elements that are unique and original to the German version. The living couple in this version are called Emma and Felix. They are played by Cristina Dorego and Benito Bowser. It's interesting to see that the German version, all of the ghosts are white, but they have obviously then gone more diverse in their casting for the living couple, but it's very possible that we will see a more diverse group of ghosts over time, and it may be partly because of taking a lot of direct inspiration from the British show. There are a few ghosts we can see in this cast photo who have clear counterparts in the British version, the American version, or both. Obviously, one of the core ghosts is that relative of the young woman who is the uptight late 19th or early 20th century lady of the manor. In the German version, that's Countess Adelheid, played by Anja Vidra. She is the equivalent of Lady Button Fanny or of Hetty. Her costume looks like it dates from the late 19th century or possibly the very early 20th. So whether she will be closer to Fanny or to Hetty is hard to say, but they're quite similar characters anyway, and I'm sure she'll have some of her own attributes and characteristics as well. Interestingly, where the American show cut Thomas altogether, the German show has a direct equivalent. He's one of the ones that looks to be the closest to the British character. Friedrich Dorn, played by Alexander Kwon. He's described in the press release as a love-hungry poet, and his costume is almost identical to Thomas's, so this looks like a very clear parallel to Thomas. There isn't a direct parallel to Pat in this version. So that's quite interesting that clearly the German writers felt like the character they wanted to pretty much transpose from the British version into Germany was the romantic poet. Romantic poetry, very popular in Germany, very important in the history of German literature. There's some absolutely beautiful German poetry produced throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. So it's interesting that that's the character they've decided to pretty much transpose into their version. Then another one who crops up in most versions, the youngest ghost, Joachim, played by Sebastian Frotz, who is parallel to Julian or Trevor, but has a different job again. He's not a politician or a stockbroker. Joachim is an insurance salesman. He is very obviously wearing a shirt, jacket and tie and no pants or trousers. He's got a bit of a smirk. The actor is doing a bit of a smirk in this photo. So I think he's probably going to be closer in personality to Julian, who's a lot sleazier and slimier than Trevor, but we'll see. We have a clear parallel to Robin in Urs, played by Jan van Veda. He is a Neanderthal, so going even slightly further than Robin. Robin's always described as a caveman without being very specific. Urs is specifically not actually Homo sapiens, so that's going to be really interesting, and he will presumably speak in broken German the way Robin speaks in broken English. And he will be the oldest ghost in any version so far, although obviously similar to Robin. And then we have a fairly close parallel in Griet, played by Meltem Kaptan, who is a parallel to Mary but not Flower. She has aspects of Mary from the British one, but they don't seem to be incorporating the aspects of Flower. I think those have gone in a different character. Griet is described as a feminist maid, and her costume is very similar to Mary's and looks burnt. So she has presumably been burned as a witch, and in fact many more people were executed in the witch trials in early modern Europe in Germany than in England, by a factor of thousands. There were 2,000 cases tried in Cologne alone where the show is being filmed. So it makes sense that the German version is incorporating a victim of the witch trials, especially when you've got the British one that you're taking inspiration from. But it sounds like they've gone in a slightly more serious, still a sitcom obviously, but this character is going to be a feminist. She's probably going to be quite forthright and not have that kind of slightly spacey, not quite with it aspect that Mary has and that Mary shares with Flower. And then we have a couple of characters who seem to have a mix of inspiration from different US and UK characters. So we've got a Roman, yay! I think it's a shame that the British one doesn't have a Roman. I've always thought that. So Urs is the oldest ghost in the German one, but we also have another very old ghost who's going to be several hundred years older than Thorfinn, and that is Claudius, played by Max Giermann, who is a Roman legionnaire. So he is probably going to be more of a counterpart to the Captain and Isaac, because we've already got Urs. He might have a bit of Thorfinn in him as well. Thorfinn is quite violent and likes to solve things with violence because he's a Viking. The Captain and Isaac are from much more recent periods and are much more gentlemanly. So Claudius might have a bit of Thorfinn in him, but I suspect actually he's going to be more of a parallel to the Captain or Isaac. I don't know what way they'll go with his sexuality, but it would make sense in a Roman context. He would potentially be gay, and that's not something a Roman would particularly need to hide necessarily, so it'll be interesting to see where they go with that. It's also interesting to see that where the American version increased the number of 20th century characters, the German version has decreased the number of 20th century characters. I suspect that has something to do with that issue of we don't really want a ghost from a point in history that was so horrifying there is nothing funny to say about it. So I suspect the German version will probably avoid the early 20th century. Later 20th century is fine, and that is where Svenny comes from, played by Sina Choch. She seems to be a mixture of Flower and Pat/Pete. She's a teacher, so I think we can assume she's not high at all times. She has Pat and Pete's method of death. We can clearly see on the photo an arrow sticking through her neck. So presumably, rather than some kind of scout leader, again, possibly not something with the same connotations in Germany, depending on what period you're looking at. She's a school teacher who has presumably been accidentally killed by a child in her charge, as Pat and Pete were. Her outfit looks very 1970s, which suggests she's more from Flower's time period. Pat and Pete are from the 80s, and it's possible that she may have some of Flower's kind of more hippie views and attitudes, but without the drugs, because she's a school teacher. So that's a really interesting mix in the German version of inspiration directly from the UK version and inspiration from the US version. They seem to have mainly gone with the UK version or with their own thing. I think Claudius may end up being really very much his own character, and Svenny will probably end up growing into her own character rather than a kind of weird mix of Flower and Pat Pete. So they are doing their own thing as well. But it's an interesting mix. It seems to be more inspired by the British one, but then Germany and Britain are both European. Britain could have had a Roman ghost, they just chose not to. Germany, yeah, possibly for obvious reasons, avoided a World War II ghost. But they do have a lot of shared history. Things like the witch trials. Again, I'm aware there were the witch trials in Salem, but those are a bit more of a one-off in America, whereas they went on for years and years in early modern Europe. The Australian version we don't know much about yet at all. We know it's going to be in an old mansion and there will be a living couple and a bunch of ghosts, and that's pretty much it. So I'm just going to indulge in some wild speculation. But I suspect it might end up being slightly closer to the American version for that reason. Australia is a place that was inhabited already by many people, and then Europeans came in and colonized it. So I would imagine it'll end up having some things in common with the American version. So if I'm going to wildly speculate what characters might show up in the Australian version, I'm guessing we will have a Lady of the Manor. I'm assuming the old mansion will be a British colonial type mansion, of which there would be plenty in Australia from the 19th century, maybe early 20th. And there will be a Fanny Hetty Countess Adelheid character who's quite prim and proper. If you think of Picnic at Hanging Rock, which is a very famous, quite ghosty story set in Australia, there was a film version and there was a TV series a bit more recently, and that's set at a girls' boarding school. And it wouldn't surprise me if in the Australian version, at some point, the house has been used as a girls' boarding school and there's a ghost from that period. So it might even end up being a head teacher. Take a bit of inspiration from the German version there, who was a head teacher of a girls' boarding school in that period, if they don't go the aristocracy/robber baron route. I think there'll be a Julian Trevor Joachim, the most recent ghost, therefore from a time period where all of those countries have much more in common because of globalization. Probably another job again, maybe, unless they go with insurance salesmen again, like the Germans. Or he could be a stockbroker, probably not a sleazy politician, but I don't know much about Australian politics. Maybe that would work. I think there might be a Pat Pete. As far as I know, I think scouting type groups are relatively popular in Australia, but let me know in the comments if you know otherwise. I'm assuming there will be a First Nations character, and I would imagine they'll go a similar route to Cesarpis by having them be a character from maybe just before a major colonisation period. So that they can be from that culture without too much trauma. Because again, there's awful things. Oh, most of the awful things were done by the British, I should acknowledge. I'm well aware of that. Awful things done to First Nations people in Australia, and not funny. So I wouldn't be surprised if we ended up with basically a Cesarpis parallel character in the Australian version. And from Australian history, I'm expecting to see an outlaw Ned Kelly type. Who maybe was hiding in the house or was from before the house was built or something. But that's kind of a major figure in Australian folk history. So I would expect to see that. And because I'm British, I kind of expect a 1980s soap opera star or pop singer, and that character could have that singing power that the little girl ghost Jemima and Alberta have. My desire to see a soap star or pop singer might just be because I grew up on Neighbours and Kylie Minogue. So maybe Australians don't feel the same way British people do about their soap operas and pop stars, but there are a heck of a lot of very well-known Australian actors, actresses and pop stars and musical theatre stars like Hugh Jackman. So I hope that they will have some kind of musical character inspired to an extent by Alberta and with Alberta's ghost power, but maybe attach it to like 80s pop tunes or something. That would be really cool. Okay, that was my not as quick as I intended it to be rundown of all the different versions of ghosts. If this video does well and if there's any demand for it, I will do an updated version once we know more about the German and especially Australian versions. But I hope you enjoyed that as a kind of fun little exploration of ghosts, history and folklore across the different sitcoms for Halloween. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. If you love ghost stories, my book Creepy Classics is out now from Amazon. 13 short stories inspired by real ghost stories from ancient Rome. When I say real, I mean they're from real Roman texts. Some of them are from plays and poems, but they all originally appeared in an actual Roman text. And then they have been retold by me in a more modern format. 12 of them originally featured on my podcast, Creepy Classics. There is a 13th, which is book exclusive. So do pick up a copy now if you love ghost stories and you want something spooky to read for Halloween. Subscribe to my channel for myth, legend, folklore, ghost stories, and weird and wonderful history in general. And happy Halloween! Until next time, bye! That's my good girl. You did very well. Whoa, watch the camera! Don't hurt the fancy camera. Good girl.